Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Berks History Center. It's very good to see all of you here on a Saturday morning. We're never sure for our June program what kind of crowd we're going to get because we're competing with the Reading Air Show, but we're really glad that you all chose to come be with us this morning. Just a few quick business notes. June 27th for members of the History Center is our annual meeting. If you're interested in attending, check in with Elise at the front desk and you can get signed up for that. And we've got a couple events coming up in July. We have a program on the history of whiskey distilling in Berks County that will include samples of whiskey provided by Eight Oaks Distillery. We're up in New Tripoli, Pennsylvania. So they'll be here with us. So it'll be kind of a collaborative event and we're very excited about that. I think there was information about that left on your seats, and also information with Rick back at the sign-up table. As a reminder, we typically take off July and August. We don't do second Saturdays those 2 months. So we'll be back with second Saturday in September with a really great program being delivered by Brian Engelhardt, who's with us, on Pontiac's Rebellion, which is sort of the climax of a period of the French and Indian War. So that's going to be a great program. We hope you come back and join us for that in September. We're also very excited today to have with us Michael Harris as our presenter. So Michael has a lot of experience working with historic sites. He worked at Fredericksburg Battlefield, the famous Civil War site. He was at Daniel Boone Homestead, and he really developed a passion for Revolutionary War when he began as the educator at Brandywine Battlefield Historic Park. And I'm actually very good friends with the director at Brandywine Battlefield. And he tells me Michael is probably the most knowledgeable person in the nation on the subject of Brandywine Battlefield. So that's pretty high praise from someone who knows that subject as well. So we're very excited to have Michael with us. And by the way, he's also a high school teacher by profession, but also an author of many books, including some which he has with us. And we're very excited to have Michael here talking about Brandywine Battlefield, and the Battle of Brandywine. And if you think about it, in the overall scheme of things, this was right down the road from us, right in our backyard. So it's certainly relevant to Berks County and the larger community of Southeast Pennsylvania. So we're very excited that he can be here with us. So please welcome Michael Harris.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you for having me. Hopefully I won't be a disappointment after that introduction, right? All right. So when the book first came out, the book's been out a while now. I used to get the question all the time, why, right? When I started at Brandywine, I transferred there from Daniel Boone in 2005. And every site I had worked at prior to that, there was at least one book I could grab and get the basics and a starting point. That really was not the case at Brandywine. There were really, prior to mine, only 2 book-length treatments. One was written in 2000-ish by a local newspaper guy, and I'll be kind and call that book Myth. There was not a lot of real history in that book. And then there was one written for the bicentennial by a guy named Samuel Smith, but I defy you to find a copy of it. My copy cost well over $100. It's been out of print since the 70s, and it's really hard to find a copy. But for its age, that book is not that bad. It's just hard to find. And so it really started as creating research files. There weren't even research files at Brandywine when I started there. So I would get a visitor inquiry about cavalry or about a specific officer, and I would do the research and create a research file. That's how it really started. And then the mystery of it is, why wasn't there more on this battle? It's the largest battle of the war. There's over 30,000 troops engaged there. It's bigger than Long Island. It's bigger than Saratoga. It's bigger than Yorktown. It took up more space than any other battle. It's more than 10 square miles. And it's the longest single-day battle of the war. First shots are at 6 in the morning, and it doesn't end till well after 6 o'clock at night. And there really wasn't a lot on it out there. And so that's kind of why I took up this project eventually. Now, it's way too much for me to try to tell you in the next 40, 45 minutes. There's way too much that happens. So I'm going to tell you as much of the story as I can through this guy's eyes. This is John Sullivan. He's one of Washington's division commanders at the time. There's a little bit of background on him there. He's from New Hampshire. He's a lawyer. He's involved with the militia before the war. When the war starts, he becomes a brigadier general, serves in Canada that first year of the war, during that failed invasion of Canada. And then right before the Battle of Long Island, he's made a major general and given division command. And then at Long Island, he gets captured. He's one of the 2 generals captured in the Battle of Long Island, not because of anything he did wrong, but what happens while he is a prisoner of war starts to make Congress look at him with an eye askew. While a prisoner, William Howe, the commander of the British forces in North America, asked him to deliver a message to Congress while a prisoner of war, seeking peace. The problem for Sullivan is the timing of this. This is August of 1776. What had Congress just done? Come on, you could say it. It's okay. They had declared independence, right? Congress has no interest in discussing peace if it doesn't involve independence at that point. So Congress was kind of like, what are you doing, dude? Leave, like, so he starts to get a bad reputation after that. All right. Then once the Philadelphia campaign starts, which actually starts up in northern New Jersey, Sullivan's division is going to be separated from the rest of the army for 7 weeks. Now, that's not because Sullivan did anything wrong. Washington charges him with defense of the Hudson Highlands, while most of the army starts to move south towards Philadelphia. And it's going to take a while for him to link back up with the rest of the army because he's tasked with something else. However, during that separation, he decides to launch an attack on Staten Island. Now, in the grand scheme of things, this is not that big a deal. He has some initial success, but he eventually gets pushed back by reinforcements that this man, this is Henry Clinton, he was the general, the British general left in New York City when William Howe left with the rest of the army. He's going to rush reinforcements over, force Sullivan back. It's going to result in the loss of about 200 guys. Now, again, this is not that big a deal, except that it's another case of bad timing. When Congress got news that Sullivan, in their eyes, had screwed up again, it was about the same time that they had found out that Fort Ticonderoga had been lost to the British forces. Does everybody know where Fort Ticonderoga is? Be honest. Does anybody not know where it's at? Some of you, I'm getting some blank stares. It's okay. Be honest with me. I need to know. All right. So if you know Hudson River goes north out of New York City, eventually you come to Lake Champlain, which separates Vermont from New York. At the southern tip of Lake Champlain is Fort Ticonderoga. So at the same time that the Philadelphia campaign is going on, there is a campaign of an army coming out of Canada moving south. That is going to result in the Battle of Saratoga. Before the Battle of Saratoga, they had to capture Fort Ticonderoga. So that was part of that secondary campaign. So Congress got news of the loss of Fort Ticonderoga about the same time they got news of Staten Island. Kind of upsetting. And they're blaming him. And they actually wanted a court of inquiry right then and there into his actions. But they were in the middle of a campaign. Washington doesn't have time to deal with that. So he basically manages to get that put on hold for now. But just keep in mind, going into the Battle of Brandywine, Congress already doesn't like him. Okay? All right. Let's fast forward. It's now early September. Sullivan has now rejoined the rest of the army in northern Delaware. And with the rest of the army, he is going to move north across the Delaware state line. And their army is going to start to form at Chad's Ford along the Brandywine River. This is where US Route 1 crosses the Brandywine River. Okay? All right. Now, who does Sullivan command? Who are the guys we're going to be talking about? There's about 1,800 of them separated into 2 brigades. It's mostly Maryland troops, with the exception of the only Delaware regiment in the army, and an odd regiment out of Canada, which I'll explain in a second. Keep in mind, many of these guys are new to the army. The army that fought in 1776 had basically evaporated after the battles of Trenton and Princeton. That army had 1-year enlistments. Those enlistments expired at the end of 1776. So throughout the spring, summer, and fall, there are new recruits coming into the Army. They basically had to build a new Army on the fly. Congress had created a new Army with 3-year enlistments, but they had to form those regiments. They had to form those brigades. They had to form new divisions. So they were rebuilding the Army on the fly. Now, yes, some of the officers in the NCOs re-enlisted, but the vast majority of these guys had not even served in 1776. And this is pre-Valley Forge. So they hadn't been through the training regimen that they're going to get, that they're known for getting at Valley Forge. None of that had happened yet. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. All right. One of the brigades, I believe, is commanded by this guy. This is Colonel John Stone. The actual brigade commander, William Smallwood, is not with the Army. When they were down in Maryland, he was detached to help raise the Maryland militia. So when they cross into Pennsylvania, their actual brigade commander is not with them. Stone is the senior colonel of the brigade, which is why I think he's commanding the brigade. If you're into these kind of the details, these are the regiments of the brigade. The other brigade is commanded by a French officer, Prudhomme de Bory. I can't find an image of him, so this medal is going to represent him. Okay. Again, if you're into these kind of details, these are the regiments of the brigade. 2 odd regiments in this brigade. The German regiment. It is made up of German settlers from Pennsylvania and Maryland. The idea behind this regiment was to counteract the use of German troops by the British Army. The problem with that is this is one regiment versus dozens, but that was the idea. The other odd regiment is French Canadians, and they are known as Congress's own regiment because they were recruited in Canada during that failed campaign. These are French Catholics. Because they're not from one of the 13 states, they can't be assigned to a state. Hence why they're known as Congress's own regiment. Okay. All right. Now, a little bit more on de Bory, because he's going to play a big part in our story. French officer, 35 years of experience, volunteers to come over and help like many other foreign officers, like a Lafayette or a Kosciuszko or a Pulaski, same idea. All right. The problem with this guy is he barely speaks English. His report on the battle that is given to Washington after the battle is literally a mixture of French and broken English. Keep in mind, Washington couldn't read or speak French. His aides had to do that for him. So do you think he's going to be able to communicate with the guys under his command? Very difficultly, if at all. So keep that in mind, okay? All right, so here's our battlefield. And again, I need our honesty. This is the Brandywine battlefield. How familiar are we with this area? I'm seeing some wishy-washy looks. All right, I'll point out some modern landmarks for you, okay? So this is US Route 1 today, the Great Post Road. US 202 today is over here. But today at this bend in the road, it goes straight. Dilworth is a modern village. It's a cluster of buildings still there. Longwood Gardens. We're all probably familiar with Longwood Gardens, right? Longwood Gardens is right here. The Brandywine River Museum, the Wyeth Art Museum, sits right there. The modern Battlefield Park, where you could go to the visitor center and see a little movie, that is the 50 acres that is right here. Does that help a little bit? Okay. All right, so let's look at where Sullivan is the morning of the battle. Now, the vast majority of his division is right here. They're watching this road crossing. This is Britain's Ford. They're watching that crossing of the Brandywine. That is their responsibility. But Sullivan is also tasked with watching the next 3 fords to the north. So where Street Road crosses today, Route 926, is Jones's Ford. The Delaware Regiment is there. This is Colonel David Hall's guys. It's about 250 men. The next 2 to the north, Wister's Ford, where Route 52 crosses today, and Buffington's Ford, which you really got to know the area to find that one. That's where Shaw's Bridge Park is today. I realize many of you may not know where that's at, but that's where this is. This is those French Canadians, Colonel Moses Hazen. And he's got his guys split. 150 of them at Wister's Ford, 150 of them at Buffington's Ford. There is also a 2-gun artillery battery at Buffington's Ford. This is the area of Sullivan's responsibility the morning of the battle. Now, why is this important? He is the right flank of the army. He's spread out over several miles. He's only got 1,800 guys, keep in mind, and this is about a little under 7-mile front. He has 2 questionable brigade commanders, and again, he is the right flank. Okay. So the British plan, which is not really the perspective I'm presenting to you today, but just to give you some background, they're going to split their forces. About 6,800 of them are going to come straight up Route 1. This is going to be a diversionary fight to hold Washington in place. While another just under 9,000 are going to make this long 17-mile flank march to get around Washington's right rear flank. That's the British plan. All right. So how is this going to affect Sullivan? That's what we want to look at. All right. So for most of the morning, Sullivan's not involved. There is a running fight throughout the morning on the west side of the Brandywine. It's not until about 9 o'clock-ish that elements of this British force under this guy, this is Wilhelm von Kniphausen. He's one of the Hessian officers. He's leading this force up Route 1. And he's going to start to roll into this area about 9 o'clock in the morning. And Sullivan's going to skirmish with him, exchange artillery fire with him across Britain's Ford. All right, now, throughout the morning and midday hours, there is going to be a series of conflicting intelligence reports, most of which are going to come through Sullivan. All right, this is the first one, and I'll explain this in a second, but let me read it to you. Major Jameson came to me at 9 o'clock and said that he had come from the right of the army, and I might depend that there was no enemy there. This is what he's reporting to Washington. Now, you may ask why I choose this image of Washington. Because people love to portray this man at an age he never achieved. He is not an 80-year-old white-haired man leading men in the battle. That is not how we should portray him. He is 45 in this campaign. He still had red hair. He had, in fact, when he's older and he's president, that is his white hair pulled back. He never wore a wig a day in his life. All right, so this is a much more accurate representation of him during the Revolution. All right, so this is the report. Now, what is he basically saying? Oh, hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is Charles Coatsworth Pickney. He's a South Carolina officer, sort of just hanging around with Washington's staff. He does not have an official role in this battle. But he confirms what Sullivan reports. Some light horse were dispatched above the forks of the Brandywine to see if they actually had their crossed. And when they returned, brought information that there was no appearance of the enemy in that quarter. So what they're saying is they sent some cavalry up here, and they didn't find any British troops. Okay, I got no problem with that. At 9:30 in the morning, that is an accurate report because the British have not gotten that far yet. My best estimate is this is about where they are at 9:30 in the morning. So, okay, there's nothing wrong with that report. Let's fast forward a half an hour. Now we have Colonel Moses Hazen. He's our guy up here on the right flank. He reports to Sullivan that his scouts say that the British are making a flanking movement because he has patrols out here scouting these roads. Sullivan is starting to panic. He writes after the battle, I had no orders or even hints to look at any other places, but those mentioned, nor had I light troops or light horsemen furnished for the purpose. I had but 4 light horsemen, 2 of which I kept at the other upper fords, 2 to bring me intelligence. The others I kept to send intelligence to headquarters. So what is he saying? He had 4 guys on horseback, not including his officers. 2 up here and 2 down here. 4. Now, who's ex-military in here? What should the cavalry be doing? There's no ex-military guys in here? Somebody should know, right? What should you use your cavalry for? Scouting or protecting your flanks, because they're a mobile force. So in theory, they should be up here. They should be out here screening the front of the army. There were 800 cavalrymen with this army, and there are 4 with Sullivan. Guess where they actually are? That is this brick of troops right here. They are in the rear of the center of the army, not anywhere near where they need to be. All right, this is a failure, in my opinion, of Washington. All right. Let's move forward. It was ever my opinion that the enemy would come around on our right flank. This opinion I often gave the general. I wrote him that morning that it was clearly in my opinion. Remember, he got captured on Long Island. This is the exact same tactic William Howe used on Long Island. It's exactly the same. In fact, this is the 6th time William Howe used this against Washington. It wasn't a new concept. That's why he's starting to panic, because he got captured once because of this. Okay. So when he gets this information from Hazen, Washington decides to confirm it. He chooses not to listen to Moses Hazen. We'll get back to that in a second. Instead, he's going to send one of his cavalry officers to confirm what Hazen is saying. Keep in mind, this is the 18th century. They're not jumping in a helicopter and flying up there to take a look. They're on horseback. It takes time. This is not going to be instantaneous information. So he sends Bland. He could not have chosen a worse person. Theodore Bland is from Virginia. He's not a Pennsylvanian that knows these roads, these farms, anything about this area. And he's a doctor by profession. He's not a military man. But that's who they choose to send. I have 2 huge issues with this. First of all, Hazen is a veteran Army officer. He's a former British Army officer. During the French and Indian War, he's a lieutenant in the British Army. When the French and Indian War ended, he chose to stay in Canada. When the Americans invaded Canada, he chose the American cause and joined the American Army. This is a guy you should have listened to. He chooses not to. The other problem with this is there are so many Pennsylvania officers in this army that they could have chosen to send, and they don't, including men that lived on this battlefield. Again, in my opinion, another failure by Washington. Okay. All right, about noon, Washington gets a direct report, and this one doesn't come through Sullivan, from a guy named, I think it's James Ross. It's definitely Ross. I think it's James. That he has skirmished with the rear of the flanking column. Now, he decides that this is a reliable report because Ross's dad is one of the signers of the Declaration. So he decides he can trust this guy. And so based on that intelligence, he says, well, Hazen must be right. He still hasn't heard from Bland, by the way. So Hazen must be right, which means I am not facing the entire British Army down here. That means maybe I could cross the river here and defeat this portion of the British Army and deal with the part that's up here at a later date and time. So he actually orders an attack across the Brandywine. Going to look something like this. Sullivan confirms it. I was ordered to cross the Brandywine with my division and attack the enemy's left, while the army crossed below me to attack their right. So artillery fire, skirmishing is just starting to intensify. This is Timothy Pickering. He's the Army's adjutant general. He confirms it. It was satisfactorily concluded that only a part of the enemy's army was on the other side of Chad's Ford, and in consequence, preparations were made for attacking. And this is just starting to escalate. Maybe a few regiments had actually crossed the Brandywine when another report comes in, this time from a militia officer. Major Joseph Spear, this is Sullivan writing, Major Joseph Spear of the militia, who came this morning from a tavern called Martin's, I'll explain this in a second, in the forks of the Brandywine. He came from thence to the Welch's Tavern and heard nothing of the enemy. So what Spear claims he did is that he left from here. This is where the modern village of Marshallton is. The ruins of this tavern are still there. He claims he rode from there to Welch's Tavern. That's the entrance to Longwood Gardens today. And back to Sullivan, and he didn't see anybody. Process that for a second. He rode right through here where 9,000 soldiers are marching with wagons and artillery and horses, and he didn't see anybody. Take that in for a second, okay? And I could confirm, because we'll read a quote later on, that this column was kicking up a lot of dust on the dirt roads. So even if you don't see them, you would have seen the dust clouds. Okay. But that's what Spear claims. Sullivan doesn't believe him, but he felt duty bound to inform Washington what this guy said. And this is what he writes after the battle. Had the general crossed over the Brandywine and found the whole British army well posted in his front, and his army put to a rout having unfordable river in his rear, and he had afterwards found out that I had received and withheld that intelligence, which could have prevented the misfortune, and demanded my reasons, I believe I never should have been able to give one, which would have been satisfactory to him, to Congress, the world. He goes on to write, this intelligence did by no means alter my opinion upon an apprehension that General Howe would take that advantage which any good officer in a situation would have done. But he told Washington anyway. You know why he did that? That's CYA. He's covering his butt, just in case it is right. Okay. All right. So Washington panics because if Spear's right, he's facing the entire British army here, and he's crossing a river to attack it with his back to the river. That's a bad idea. So this never really fully escalated. So he calls it off and pulls these guys back. And just as they're coming back is when we get Theodore Bland to finally send a report. And Bland reports, I have discovered a party of the enemy on the heights, just on the right of the two Widow Davises. I'll show you this on the map in a second, who live close together on a road called the Fork Road, and about a half mile to the right of the meeting house. He is seeing the British form on this hill, Osborne's Hill. The meeting house he describes as Birmingham Meeting House. Bland is probably approximately here when he's writing that dispatch, based on the description. The two Widow Davises own the farms on either side of this intersection. All right, so this is what he's witnessing. Sullivan reports, Colonel Bland has at this moment sent me word that the enemy are in the rear of my right, about 2 miles coming down. There are, he says, about 2 brigades of them. There's actually a lot more than that. He also says he saw a dust back in the country for about an hour. He sees the dust cloud. Okay. All right. The very first intelligence I received that they were actually coming that way, I instantly communicated to Washington. So now we're in panic mode. We need to shift a whole lot of troops up there to deal with that. Let me get a sip here and because we're getting into the heart of the battle here now. All right. All right, so here you go. Let me point out some stuff here. You got the British forming up on Osborne's Hill after their very long 17-mile flank march on a very late, hot, humid, late summer day. There's cases of heat exhaustion and dying on that march. 3 divisions are rushed up. Lord Stirling's, Adam Stevens' division. There's no known image of Adam Stevens, so that's who these guys are. They took a roundabout route coming off the map here to get up on the Birmingham Hill. John Sullivan's division, which was at Britain's Ford, they're going to cut cross country. You can see how that's why they're going to end up out of position from the other 2 divisions. Okay, now several things are going to happen pretty rapidly here. All right, Moses Hazen, the guy that was way up the river, he has to sneak past this flank of the British to link back up with the rest of the division. That happens without a problem. Now, here's where we set up disaster. So Sullivan was told by Washington, when you go up north, you are to take command of all 3 of these divisions, because Washington doesn't go up there. Because Sullivan is senior to all of these guys. So when you get up there, you take command of this wing of the army. Okay? Who does that leave in command of his own division? Our French friend, Prudhomme de Boré. Everybody see how we're setting up for disaster here? Okay, remember the guy doesn't speak a lot of English? Okay, that guy. All right, so the other thing that happens before he rides over to talk to these 2 officers, Sullivan realizes that there's a problem with his own division. This is what he writes about it. I then found it necessary to turn off to the right to form and to get nearer to the other 2 divisions, which I that moment found discovered drawn up on an eminence, both in the rear and to the right of the place I was then at. What's he talking about? Well, they're up here. He basically looks over his right rear shoulder and sees the other 2 divisions up on the hill behind them. And so he says to the Bore before he rides off to talk to Sterling and Stephen, hey, get my division in line with the other two, but I need to leave to go talk to them. And rides off. Okay. All right, he gets over here and he realizes that the British formation is going to outflank them to the right. So he shifts Sterling and Stevens' divisions to the right. That's not a problem. That happens. The problem's over here. So the Bore, now remember, this is pre-Valley Forge. The Bore, rather than just about face these guys, march them straight south and about face them again. He doesn't do that. He puts them back into a marching column like they're going to march down a road and marches them over the top of Birmingham Hill, swings east, and then he's going to try to wheel in battle formation back up onto the hill. It's a very complicated maneuver for guys that don't really have a lot of experience maneuvering in compact formations. And they are in the middle of this maneuver when the British decide to launch their attack. All right, now we're going to focus over here. All right, this is Edward Matthew. He's the Brigadier General in command of the British Brigade of Guards, this formation on the right of the British attack formation. And they're the ones that are going to hit Sullivan. And they are literally in the middle of that maneuver when they slam into them. Okay? So a couple quotes here. I'm not going to read them all. There's a lot more in the book, but just a couple to give you a flavor of this. This is Sir George Osborne. He's the commander of the British Grenadier Guards. He wrote, "We attacked the left flank of the rebel army and raining upon the brigades of Sullivan with an impetuosity really that would have been scarcely possible for them to resist. We saved much loss we might otherwise have sustained, and we certainly made the enemy first give way." A quote from the American side. This is John Stone, who again, I think is one of the brigade commanders. Let me read his quote, then I'll explain what he's saying here a little bit better for you. He says, "I wheeled off, but had not reached the ground before we were attacked on all quarters, which prevented our forming regularly. And by wheeling to the left, it doubled our division on the brigade immediately in the rear of the other. Thus, we were in confusion." So you got to kind of imagine you have two brigades in a formation like this, and they're going to try and wheel up onto that hill. Where they are in the middle of doing that when the brigade in front gets slammed by the Brigade of Guards, and they retreated through the other one, messing this one up. Does that make sense? And it therefore messes up both brigades. That's what Stone is describing. Okay. This image is about the size of a postcard. It is painted into the inside of the back cover of Lord Cantilupe's diary. It's in a college archives over in England. But it's really small. I have it blown up here so you can see it better. And what are we looking at here, right? Well, at the top, that is Birmingham Hill. We are looking south. This is Street Road, modern 926, running across the bottom of the painting. Along the fence line of that road, you can see little tiny red brushstrokes. That is one battalion of the British Brigade of Guards. You could see elements of Sullivan's division peeking up over the hill. What's even cooler about this is I know it's hard to see, but here and here, you have horses moving artillery with guys with little blue brush strokes because Royal artillerymen wore blue, not red. The other cool thing about this, that house and that house still stand. So you can find the spot. And today it looks like that. So this is, oh, hang on. So you got Birmingham Hill up there. You got Street Road right here. This is a modern neighborhood I'm up on the road to. So I think Cantilupe, the British stayed on the battlefield for 5 days after the battle. I think sometime in that 5-day period, Cantilupe sat on this slope somewhere and painted that image into his diary. I just think that's really cool. This is probably the earliest known image of Chester County, Pennsylvania. It's just really cool stuff. Okay. All right. Let's move on. So Sullivan realizes he's got himself a disaster, and he rides into this mess to try to rally his division. But he writes after the battle, no sooner did I form one party, that which I had before formed, would run off. And even at times when I, though on horseback and in front of them, apprehended no danger. I then left them to be rallied if possible by their own officers in my aides de camp. So he basically gives up, realizes he can't rally this, and he's going to try to hold the hill with the other two divisions. And this is why he writes, this hill commanded both the right and left of our line, and if carried by the enemy, I knew would instantly bring on a total rout and make the retreat very difficult. I therefore determined to hold it as long as possible. But he really has no shot, because that's what he's up against. And with his own division broken, basically this is like a row of dominoes. The British are going to be able to keep turning that flank and peeling this back one regiment at a time, literally like dominoes. And they're going to collapse and retreat over the hill through these hollows, through the village of Dilworth, south to where we're taking the story at this point. Okay. When we found the right and left oppressed by numbers and giving way on all quarters, we were obliged to abandon the hill we had so long contended for. But not till we had almost covered the ground between that and Birmingham Meeting House with the dead bodies of the enemy. And this is the source of one of the myths of the battle. There's a lot of American reports that claimed thousands of British dead in this field. Well, keep in mind, the Americans are not on the battlefield that night. They're not the ones burying anybody or picking up the wounded. They're long gone by the time that happens. And so they did see bodies laying on the ground. But William Howe had issued orders to his regiments in 76, and that order still held, that when the Americans fire a volley at you, drop to the ground and let the bullets go over your head. So in the smoke and confusion of battle, men purposely lying on the ground probably did look like a lot of dead people, but not in the numbers the Americans would later claim. Okay. All right, so they're retreating. So Birmingham Hill's up here. They are retreating through these farm fields, and they're eventually going to form this thing back here. And actually, I need to update these maps if we ever redo them, because my current research and my current visit on properties I didn't have access to in the past. This should actually be shifted up a little bit, but be that as it may. So what's happening here is they need to form a rear guard and hold the roads open for the army to retreat. And Charles Coatsworth Pinckney claims this was Sullivan's idea. I have no other source, so maybe Pinckney's right. But this is what he writes. Sullivan proposed to the general to halt Greene's fresh division, Nathaniel Greene's fresh division, there to display and take the enemy in flank as they came down. Washington acceded to this, and I was directed to carry the orders. So several things are happening. Washington is actually spotted in the yard of this house, the William Burton house, which still stands. And so there's this discussion probably happened there. And what they want to do is form this. They want to put Greene's fresh division here and rally elements of those three divisions that fought up on Birmingham Hill on opposite sides of Greene's division to hold this road. This is the main road to Wilmington. That's what they're talking about here. Henry Knox has showed up at this point with a couple artillery pieces, and you've got elements of Sullivan's divisions at this point rallied behind various fence lines as they're doing this fighting retreat. And ultimately, you're going to have something that looks like this. They halt at one fence line, and then they fall back to another fence line, and then ultimately they're going to reform on opposite sides of Greene's fresh division, forming this U-shaped formation. Now, what's important here, this is why it's important to visit battlefields, because you can't get this perspective reading it in a document, is that there is a ridge line that runs through here. And pursuing British troops can't see what's on the other side of that ridge line. And that's where this formation is being created. It's also getting late in the day. There's no daylight savings in the 18th century. So the sun was going down behind the British. So as they crest this ridge line, they are silhouetted against the setting sun, making them easy targets. And that's what happens. A battalion of British Grenadiers initially is the first ones. They get caught here. You see, they can get shot at from three sides, triangulation of fire. And then a fresh British brigade, the 4th Brigade, comes in to support them, and they're going to get chewed up too. Just to give you a sense of this, this is where I think the highest British casualties of the day are, by the way. The 64th afoot, which was positioned right about there, took 45% casualties. That is excessively high casualties for an 18th century battle. All right. This is how the battle ends. Because the British are like, we don't know what else is out there. Because it's getting dark at this point. And that allowed Greene and Anthony Wayne's division over here to hold the roads open for the army to retreat that night. All right. That's how the battle's going to come to an end. Now, as I'm running out of time here, what's the aftermath, right? Guess who got blamed? Why did I choose to focus on John Sullivan, right? John Sullivan gets blamed by Congress. So 3 days after the battle, September 14th, Congress votes to recall Sullivan pending an investigation into his actions at Staten Island and Brandywine. That same day, our French friend, Deborah, resigns from the army. He's leaving for France. I'm out, man. All right. So that all happens the same day. That same day, Washington writes to Congress saying, no way, dude, you can't have this court of inquiry right now. Our situation at this time is critical and delicate. To derange the army by withdrawing so many general officers from it may and must be attended with many disagreeable, if not ruinous consequences. To have a court-martial of a 2-star general, you need other 2-star generals to sit on that court. You can't court-martial somebody with people of lesser rank. That's just going to create problems. You can't have a bunch of captains and lieutenants court-martial a 2-star general. Well, to do this, you would have to pull every 2-star general from the army to conduct this court of inquiry. Can't do it. Look at the timing of this. This is 2 days before the Battle of the Clouds. 5 days later is the Battle of Paoli. A week or two after that's the Battle of Germantown. There is too much going on. All right. So Sullivan starts to gather information. Even though the court's not happening yet, he knows it's coming. So I have a whole appendix on this in the book. I'm just going to give you a couple examples. He starts to gather testimony, documents. This is Thomas Conway. He's one of the brigade commanders and Sterling's division. He wrote, if part of the division was not formed completely before the engagement, the fault cannot be imputed to General Sullivan. The short time left to his troops in order to form was hardly sufficient for well-disciplined troops and well-exercised, and by no means sufficient for troops of this army. Remember, pre-Valley Forge. All right, this is William Wilcox. He's an aide on Lord Sterling's staff. Says the enemy, by good luck or perhaps policy, made their attack before the intended disposition of your division could be carried into execution. It was therefore rather to be considered as unfortunate as ill-judged and not to be laid at the door of any particular officer. What did Washington have to say? I ascribed the misfortune principally to the information of Major Spear. Remember that militia officer had said he couldn't find anybody. And transmitted to me by you. Yet I never blamed you for conveying the intelligence. On the contrary, I should have thought you culpable in concealing it. The major's rank, reputation, and knowledge of the country gave him a full claim to credit and attention. His intelligence was no doubt a most unfortunate circumstance, but it was not your fault that the intelligence was eventually found to be erroneous. Now, when I wrote the book, I didn't think the court-martial actually happened because I hadn't found the documents. And when I was working on my Germantown book, for those of you who don't know, Adam Stephen is court-martialed after Germantown. When I was hunting down the Adam Stephen court-martial papers, I found the John Sullivan papers. So even though in the Brandywine book, it doesn't say it happened, it did. I didn't know it when I wrote the book. But he is going to be exonerated. My current theory is Washington just saved him. Plus the overwhelming evidence, the military evidence, was that it was not Sullivan's fault. Why did they push this so far? It has to do with this guy. Thomas Burke was a congressman from North Carolina and happened to be hanging out with the army the day of the battle. And he claimed he witnessed Sullivan doing all these things that there's no documentation for. And he's the one that pushed the court of inquiry. And it does happen after the Battle of Germantown. There's 4 court-martials after Germantown. Sullivan, Anthony Wayne for Paoli, and Adam Stephen for Germantown, and William Maxwell for Brandywine, the Battle of the Clouds. All three of the four are exonerated. One is kicked out of the army. Anybody know who's kicked out of the army? No, it's Stephen. Stephen is one of only two generals ever be kicked out of the army. Anybody know who the other one is? It's Charles Lee after Monmouth. All right, but that's side history, and that's a whole nother topic. All right, but I think that's the end here. What happens to Sullivan? He does lead his division at Germantown, fights very well there. He's involved with a Native American expedition later in the war against the Mohawk. He returns to New Hampshire after the war, helps ratify the Constitution, and then he's appointed a federal judge by Washington when he becomes president. He dies in 1795. This is his grave up in New Hampshire. I trespassed a little bit to get this picture because it's actually his home still stands, but it's private now, and the family cemetery is in the back in the woods behind the house. And I kind of snuck in there to get a picture. I don't recommend that. But there's a lovely veterinarian office right next door, and the parking lot is right next to the woods. I kind of snuck in. But that's a picture of his grave up there. All right. So questions, I got copies of my books, but if you got questions, I'll take them now.